Sometimes I think to myself, I just finished a big project. I should do something small and easy. Use up some scraps that are laying around, not get stressed out, and just knock out something fairly quick. I guess it doesn't happen every time, but it happens often enough that I really shouldn't be surprised anymore. I decide to do a small project, sometimes non-furniture related, because I want to do something quick and stress-free, or at least that's how I plan it. Like this one, turn a few wooden spheres, hang them up on a few strips of wood, and I'll have a solar system mobile to go into my son's room. It'll be great. The reality though is that these types of quick and easy projects rarely end up being quick or easy, and I should know that by now. But nonetheless, I ventured into this with a clear head and a childlike naivete about how it would all go. So come along with me, won't you? Like I mentioned, I'm making a wooden solar system mobile. So let's talk like we know some science real quick. I needed to turn 9 spheres, 1 for each planet and 1 for the sun. Sorry Pluto, you're out. Obviously, I wouldn't be making these to scale because if I went with a 3-inch diameter for the Earth, the sun would need to be over 27 feet, and our lathe has a max capacity of around 22 inches in diameter. So if I do some quick math,
it's too small.
So I decided to just go with sizes that generally gave the look and feel of how big each planet should be relative to each other. And with that, I could start actually making them, and I first needed to glue up some blanks. The blank for each planet was slightly different depending on the desired finished size, as well as the material I had on hand, but for the most part, I made a block that was slightly wider than the diameter of the sphere I would be making, and also a few inches longer to accommodate the tenon I needed to make to chuck it onto the lathe. So it was some light milling and cutting chunks to rough dimension so that I could glue them up and get them to proper size in order to start turning. I decided that I didn't want to attempt to try to make perfect replicas of each planet, but instead, like with the sizing, I just wanted them to have the general feel. And I wanted to utilize the different species of wood that we have on hand to do that. So as we go through the process, I'm going to be jumping around between the different planets, but if you're ever lost, just check down here in the handy Planet ID box. Most of them were made up of a single species, except Jupiter, which you can see here, mahogany and maple for that one. So with the blanks glued up, I could start by marking the center point on each end, then marking the rough diameter of the finished sphere. I did this so that I could cut off the 90-degree corners on each block, which would make turning them into a cylinder much quicker and easier. As you can see here, I was able to turn the blanks down into cylinders pretty quickly and easily. With the blanks now in cylindrical form, and ideally at this point, the diameter of the cylinder would be roughly equal to my desired diameter of the sphere I was making. In reality, I left mine a little bit big because I knew I would need a little wiggle room as I kept working them towards their finished shape. Regardless of that, at this point I needed to mark out the size of the sphere to give me some guidelines while turning. With the blank in this configuration on the lathe, I would just start to roughly shape the outer half of the sphere. I would also just cut in a bit on the inner half, but this was mostly to make it easier to trim the blank later on. The main thing I would do at this point is cut in a tenon on the innermost side so that I could use a chuck to hold the blank on the lathe. And once it was in place, I could finesse that outer half of the sphere much more accurately. This part of the process is fairly critical because in order to turn the other half of the sphere, I have to use a jam chuck, which I'll get to in a second. But first, once I was happy with the shape of the outer half of the sphere, I could take it to the bandsaw and trim off the tenon portion of the blank. No going back now. I then needed to make a couple jam chucks. I decided to make 2 of them, and I knew if I stayed organized, I could use these two to turn all the different sized planets. The idea is that you cut a recess into a larger cylinder, which you can then, that's right, jam the spherical side of the blank into, and it allows you to turn the other half of the sphere. By organizing the order of turning from smallest to largest, I could keep using the same jam chuck the whole way through the project. Like I mentioned, I actually ended up using two different size jam chucks, one for the smaller planets and one for the larger planets, because I have very little idea what I'm doing, and hindsight is always 20/20. So with the jam chuck ready to go, I could start turning the second half of the sphere, which, if the first half fits nicely into the chuck, should go fairly smoothly. But like I said, I have very little idea what I'm doing, so this is where things start getting not so quick and easy. But Jupiter believe I managed to turn the second half of each sphere. So we're moving in the right direction, and don't worry, it gets better from here. Or I guess it gets worse from here, depending how you look at it. As much as each half might look like a sphere to my severely untrained eye, I had indeed not turned spheres at this point. Honestly, they were a little more like eggs. Because of this, the technique to make actual spheres involves rotating the egg in the jam chuck to then turn half of the sphere on the perpendicular axis. It makes perfect sense, and as you continue to rotate and repeat this process, you eventually work your way to a near perfect sphere. Now, as you can see here, my initial shapes were indeed closer to eggs than spheres, and they didn't fit particularly well into the jam chuck, which resulted in a lot of this. I suppose if I were better at the initial shaping, this next part would have been easier, but I'm not, so it wasn't. But regardless of my lack of skill, I once again persisted, and with a lot of delicate, light cutting, and though I must have popped each planet off the lathe at least a half dozen times, I eventually got each one to as close to a sphere as I needed. And all I needed was for it to look like a sphere, and now that I think about it, I don't even think the actual planets are perfect spheres either. Hey Chris, do you know if the planets are actually perfect spheres?
You know, it's funny you should ask that because I've been asking myself that same thing and crunching the numbers, and I found some interesting things. So if you were to look kind of down here in this region, what you're going to notice is that...
Anyway, once the planets were into spherical shape, I needed to sand and finish them. With the larger ones, I could use a random orbit sander, and with the smaller ones, it was just by hand. But I sanded them up to around 600 grit, then I could apply some finish to them, and even with the frustration up to this point, I was pretty happy with how they were turning out. So this exact same process was repeated for each planet, except for old Saturn. Because of its rings, I needed to change up the approach slightly. And actually, to explain it better, I'm gonna hand it over to the self-described #1 fan of Saturn. He's constantly reminding me that a planet's not a planet unless it has rings. So Chris, tell us the best approach for making Saturn out of wood.
Thanks, Sean. Now, as the #1 fan of Saturn, I'm constantly having to remind people that a planet's just not a planet unless it has rings. So I think the best approach for making the best planet would be to start off by heading...
Actually, sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to thank Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. Both Chris and I have been using Squarespace to build and maintain our websites for years now, and honestly, it's one of the best choices we made when starting our businesses. At the time, I had no idea what I needed to do to build a website, but Squarespace makes it super easy to get up and running with plenty of professional looking templates to choose from, as well as making things like purchasing domains really simple. Squarespace also has plenty of e-commerce tools to help you grow your business, things like inventory management, a simple and secure checkout process, and unlimited products allow us to easily manage online transactions and not get bogged down with mundane tasks so that we can devote more time to doing the things we enjoy, like turning planets on the lathe. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you already have one, go check out Squarespace to see if it might be a better option for you. Head over to squarespace.com/4eyes for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, use the offer code 4eyes to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, thanks Squarespace. Now let's get back to Chris.
Actually, and if you follow those tips, That's gonna be the best way to make the best planet. Take it from me, I'm the #1 fan of Saturn.
Wow, that sure sounds like a great approach. Thanks, Chris. Actually, I'm gonna be honest. Chris has no idea what he's talking about, and he's not even the #1 fan of Saturn. So let's get back to what I actually did to make this planet. I first glued up a blank with 2 solid wood halves, then a layer of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood in the middle. Once that was dry, I could start Saturning. It was a similar process of first roughing everything into cylinders, but from there the main difference was that I wouldn't be able to use the jam chuck to rotate and turn this one into a perfect sphere. Instead, I had to get the 2 halves as close to spherical as I could by eye. To help with this, I would use one of the planets I already made and reference it as I shaped the 2 halves on Saturn. It worked relatively well, and with the rings in between the 2 halves, you really can't tell how far off I may or may not be. But at this point, the planets are done, and all I needed to do was assemble everything into a perfectly balanced and spaced out rotating mobile, which at the time I thought would be the easy part. So I first attached some hooks onto the top of each planet, making sure to attach them so the planet's vertical axis was tilted properly. I then needed to measure and make the wooden arms that would hold the planets out from the center. From there, I used some thin wire to suspend each planet off the ends of each arm, and this is where things get a little tricky. To make the whole apparatus work properly, I needed 1 planet on the end of each arm, and I needed each planet to be spaced evenly so they wouldn't hit when rotating. And I needed each arm to be perfectly balanced so that everything hung evenly. And what I realized is that I had found one of those project management triangle things.
You know, it's one of these things. You basically got time, cost, and the scope of the project. You can do the project quick and cheaply, but it's going to be a small project. Big project, cheap, it's going to take a long time. Stuff like that. In my case, we have balance, spacing, and the quantity of planets on each arm. So if I want 2 planets per arm and I get them to balance, they're going to be spaced really weird. If I want 2 planets on each arm, have them spaced properly, nothing's going to balance. That's kind of the pickle I'm in.
So we actually went through all of this with the mobile and got the whole thing assembled and working by attaching wires from the ends of the arms to the center, which helped with balance and allowed everything to be spaced evenly. But just like the triangle dictates, quality was sacrificed, and the mobile just looked kind of lame and didn't rotate very naturally. So I went back to the drawing board and came up with this. I abandoned the idea that each arm would only have 2 planets, and instead used an additional planet on each arm to help balance everything. What this did was allow me to focus more on spacing, now that I knew where my center of gravity for each arm needed to be, and I no longer needed extra wires to keep everything balanced. I also used a thicker main wire to make sure everything would hang more securely, and even with reworking everything, I still barely managed to get it to work right. I guess I won't be making a career shift to engineering anytime soon. So there you go, a sun for my sun, and a Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Once again, sorry Pluto. I won't lie, it's hard making things for your first unborn child. I made him a dresser, but if I'm being honest, that was really more for my wife and I. So what do you make for somebody that you'd give the entire world to if you could? I wasn't really sure, but as I started to think about it, I I realized that if I couldn't give him the world, I guess the least I could do is just give him a bit of space.